There have been tragic instances where Jewish women felt compelled to take drastic measures in order to save the lives of their fellow Jews. When rabbis were presented with these real-life cases, they often turned to the story of Esther for inspiration and halachic guidance.
All right. One of the most prominent rabbanim in the 18th century, his name was Rabbi Yecheskel Landau, was a Noida B'Yehuda. He's known, his Svarim, his Shilos HaTshuvas are known as a Noida B'Yehuda. And he has a tshuva in Yeridea Kuf Samach Aleph, in where he discusses the following. Let's read inside. V'lo yashar be'einai, ma shero'isi be'ez hatshuva. So he tells us in the relevant quote right off the bat, I'm not happy with what I saw in a specific tshuva. Which tshuva? So he says like this, Lefi shani le'eis ata bikfar, because right now I am in the village, outside of the city of Prague. Lo yuchal lisker be'ez tshuva. I can't remember which sefer it is. When we read the tshuvas of the Noida B'Yehuda, we find that in numerous instances he writes, right now I'm outside of Prague, I'm in a kfar, I'm in a village, and I don't have my svarim with me. This he doesn't write it. He writes this in at least 10 tshuvas, maybe even more. And basically, if you read these closely, what emerges is, if you put the pieces together, is that every year between Pesach and Shavuos, he would go to what was then a village outside of Prague, which is known as Nusel, N-U-S-L-E. Today, Nusel is part of the city of Prague. But then in the 1700s, it was a suburb outside of Prague, and he would be there, and the language that he uses in many of his tshuvas is that what he's doing there is lasik berefuas. He's taking care of his health. What exactly that entailed, I'm not sure. And one of the tshuvas he writes that when I'm in the city, I'm so busy, so I have no time to answer anyone. But now when I'm in Nusel and I'm alone, I have time to write. On the other hand, he doesn't have his svarim with him. So there's a nice number of tshuvas that specifically were written because he's outside of the city in this village. But he always is writing, I don't have my svarim, and so therefore I can't be 100% certain. So right now he's saying he doesn't remember where he saw this tshuva that he doesn't like. I think she tshuvas Beis Yaakov. I think the name of the sefer is Beis Yaakov. What did he see in the tshuva that he didn't like? So he gives us the following case. It's a case of Anoshim v'Noshim sheholchu b'derech. There was a group of Jewish men and women who were traveling together. V'kam aleim arki listim echad b'sada. And an arch thief, robber, criminal, attacked them. Im chaburas listim shekamoisoi, together with his subordinates. And the objective was la'aroi geskulam, that he's going to kill this entire caravan of Jews. V'kama isha achas mehem. So one of the women who was part of this group gathered the courage. Isha yefas toyar me'oid. V'yischila lehishtadel ima ish roish halistim b'dvarim. And she started talking. And she started talking with the leader of this group. Ad shepitetoy bechelkas l'shoina. Until ultimately she seduced him. Shenis avala. V'nivala loy biyar min atzad. And so he was boil her in the yar, in the forest. Va'yedei Cain, and through this act of hers, hitzila as baila, she saved her husband who was in the group. In kol hanafasha is together with all the other people. We don't have the exact number of people, but it sounds like there was a nice group of people over there, and she saved everybody. I read this type of story right away. I think we feel outrage that human beings have to be forced to make these types of decisions. You have low lives, criminals who are roaming the streets. Whenever this story took place, we'll get a clearer picture later on. Forcing Yidden, we cherish two things very much. We cherish life, and we also cherish family sanctity. And here, because of an act of desperation, a Jewish woman felt forced to compromise one in order to save the other. And so there's definitely something that the very fact that we live in a world that features these types of events from time to time is one that is very frustrating. I'll call upon him. The Noida Yehuda says that in this tshuva sefer, the rabbi addressed this case, and he doesn't like what he said. So we open up the tshuva's Beis Yaakov to find the tshuva, to see what's going on over there. So the only real candidate for a tshuva, there's a number of svar in Beis Yaakov, the only real candidate is the following, which is Rabbi Yaakov ben Shmuel of Tzoizmir, and he has a tshuva svar called Beis Yaakov, Siman Lamed Tes. He was a rabbi in the 17th century, and his Sefer of Tshuvas was printed in the year 1696. And here, let's see what he writes. He writes as follows. We say that the din is that if a woman who's married to a Yisrael is raped chas v'shalom, she can continue to live with her husband. So let's back up a little bit of Akdam. There are certain tragic realities, and what we're going to be speaking about today is mostly tragic realities. Chas v'shalom, if a Eishes Kohen, a wife of a Kohen, is married, is raped, so although she didn't want this by any stretch of the imagination, the din is that her, Torah says that her relationship with her Kohen husband can no longer continue. And that's the din if it's a Kohen. What if it's a Eishes Yisrael? There, Eishes Yisrael, the din is different. If she wanted to commit adultery, if she went to commit adultery, the affair was consensual, this was something she was interested in, so then that's a problem. You committed adultery, so you compromised the marriage. So now now the marriage also falls apart, and they're no longer allowed to live together. Obviously, there's prate dinim that we don't have the chance to get into right now, but generally that's the din. If, however, it's a rape, this is something that she wasn't interested in, then she can continue living with her husband. So that's what he's starting over here. He's saying, that we say that if it's a Eishes Yisrael, if it's a wife and the husband is a Yisrael, Shenenso was raped, and the din is muteres labayla, that she's allowed to continue living with her husband. So now, let me give you the following scenario. Let's imagine there's a Yid, we're going to call him Yankel, and he is being forced by Goyim, she'imu alav, they threatened him, laharga, they're going to kill Yankel, im lo yiva Eishes Yisrael, if he doesn't have relations with this wife of a Yisrael. Good, so really, min hadin, what is he supposed to say? He's supposed to say, this is one of the big three, and yaroig val yavar, I'm not doing it. You can kill me, but I'm not doing it. But our question here doesn't concern him and what he's allowed to do or not allowed to do. Min hadin, he's supposed to say, I'm not going to do it. But let's say he went ahead and said he's going ahead to do it. V'hi eina anusa, the Goyim didn't say anything to her. They left her alone, the woman. And Kigoyim, but the case is, for example, shenisratzeis livel, she agreed. Why? Pasha to save this guy. Kedei la'atzilo min ha'ariga, because they told him that they're going to kill him unless he has relations with her. She feels bad for him. So she says, you know something, I want to save Yankel's life, so I'm going to consent. So that's the case. So Shaila is, is this woman permitted to her husband or not? In other words, should we look at this as a oinus? She didn't want this. This was forced upon her. It was forced upon her, so then she's mutaras labaila, is permitted. Or do you say, one second, she wasn't raped in the literal sense. What happened over here is that there was a certain situation and she stepped up to the plate, so to speak, and said, this is I'm going to do. So maybe we say, that's Ratzin. So do we look at this as a classic case of adultery, or do we look at this as a classic case of rape? In fact, it's somewhere in between. So how do we look at it? This is the shaila that Rabbi Yaakov ben Shmuel of Tzoizmir asked in Beis Yaakov Lamed Tes, and the Noida Yehuda is saying that he saw a tshuva. This is the closest you get. Why? Although on the one hand, it's not similar to, it's not the same case at all. We can see right away we're dealing with a different case. But at the same time, there is a similarity. What is a similarity? That a woman basically on her own said, I want to save a life, and the way for me to save a life is to engage in a particular act that's normally forbidden, and that's the common denominator in both cases. And so it seems that the Noida Yehuda was alluding to this tshuva in the Beis Yaakov. But at the same time, it's clear, and he himself wrote that he's not 100% sure. And indeed, this is not the tshuva he had in mind. He had in mind another tshuva. And he got confused with this because of the similarity. Remember, he didn't have his Svarim with him. Which tshuva was he referring to? A tshuva from the Shvus Yaakov, Rabbi Yaakov Reisher. Reisher is a place in Galicia, in Poland. And he was the Rav there. He lived between the 1650s and the 1730s. So he's a little before the Noida B'Yehuda. And he deals with the following case. And when we read this case, you're going to see that it matches up very well with the case of the Noida, with the case of the Noida B'Yehuda. Before we go to his case, however, I want to highlight that when you read closely Rabbi Yaakov ben Shmuel of Tzoizmir's case in Beis Yaakov, it's a very valid question to ask. Was this a real story? I'm talking about in text number 2. Was that a real story or is it a hypothetical? And I have a suspicion that it wasn't a Maisa Shahaya. Why do I have that suspicion? Notice how the tshuva starts. It starts off with a text. That's not usual. Usually a tshuva begins with a case. This happened. And then we'll start bringing in the text. His tshuva begins with a text. It says in Shulchan Aruch the following din, so let me now clear. That sounds a little more like Bachrim in a Beis Medrash having a good time than it is as a real shaila coming up. Also notice the word kigoin. In his tshuva he says, what if you have this case, kigoin, that the woman agreed, kedei lahatziloi, to save him. Kigoin? What do you mean kigoin? A story happened, why are you kigoining me? So it's very possible, and this happens sometimes in Shalos HaTshuvas Svarim, where a question is being posed, but it's not really a real case. Now, why does it matter? Well, maybe it does matter on a practical, on a spiritual level at least. We spoke a few weeks ago about the story that Rebbe often said about the Noida B'Yehuda, that the real Seyata D'Shmaya that a Rav has is when he's passing in Lamaisa. So if it turns out that it's not Lamaisa, so that actually becomes a very interesting consideration. On the other hand, the case of the Noida B'Yehuda that he told us, which we'll see in its original source momentarily, when you read it, you see it has details, it's a real case, it's a real story, and there all the evidence suggests that it's actually a real story with real people. So let's read now in the tshuva of Shvus Yaakov. Again, Beis Yaakov, Shvus Yaakov, easy to get confused between these two Svarim, both Rabbanim in Central Europe. Maybe Rabbi Yaakov ben Shmuel was a little further east, but generally speaking the same region, relatively the same era, very similar name, and yes, a similar case. So what's the tshuva of Rabbi Yaakov Reisher, Shvus Yaakov Chelik Beisim, and Kuf Yuzayin reads as follows. Shaila, Ma'aseh shehoya kach hoya. Here's the story. Seya shal bnei Adam sheholchu b'derech, a group of people were going, ve'echad mehem ishta imay, and there was a man with his wife. Vahileis erev, and it was nighttime. They go to a krechma, an inn that is near a forest, and there they met wicked murderers, that they kill. Their objective is to rob, but in order to cover up their robbery, that they engage in murder. And when they saw that it was really getting difficult, they were literally about to kill them. And they didn't listen to all the pleadings. Please, please leave us alone. We won't tell anyone. Let us free. Take our money. So then this woman made herself available, and her husband agreed to it. And through that, she saved the group. And this leads to the shaila. What's the shaila? The achshav ba ba'ila lishal. Now her husband has a shaila. The same shaila that you have in Beis Yaakov Lametes is the same shaila that you have in Shvus Yaakov. Is this his wife permitted? Again, on the one hand, you have the classic adultery case where for Eishes Yisrael, like Hayatachin, absolutely not. A woman who engaged in that, this marriage fell apart. On the other hand, you have the classic rape case, where we say, Eishes Yisrael, no problem, she should continue living with her husband, and they should have a Riches Yamim V'Shanim Tovos together and a Binyan Adayad. In both of these cases, both the Beis Yaakov's case and in the case of the Noida B'Yehuda and Rabbi Yaakov Reisher, Shvus Yaakov, it's in the middle, where she basically says, I'm going to do this, I'm choosing to do this, no one's telling me to do this, I'm choosing, and I'm initiating it, but it's not that I want to do this or whatever. It's sakaras nafashas, and this is the best chance I have to save my life and the lives around us. So what category does it go into in terms of the question of, is the husband allowed to continue living with his wife? This is the question that we have. And as we're going to see, the story of Purim, the story of Esther, the story in the Megillah becomes central to this discussion. So let's take a break from these cases, and now let's delve into some of the passages of the Megillah where we read as follows. In Esther Perek Beis, we read as follows. When Esther is introduced, it says, Va'anara yafas toyar v'toivas mara. And then it says, Uvamois avia ve'ima, and when her father and mother passed away, Likacha Mordechai loy levas. Mordechai took her as a daughter. Now, on the face of it, a most basic interpretation of this text would mean that Mordechai adopted her as one and treated her as one would treat their own daughter. However, Chazal say, no, yeah, that's true, but there's more to the truth as well. The Gemara Megillah Daf Yud Gimel Amar Aleph says, "Uvemois avia ve'ima lekacha Mordechai lo levas tana mishum Reb Meir." So we learned in the name of Reb Meir, Al tikri levas ela lebayis. Don't read levas, read lebayis. Add one little yud there, change the nikud, and instead of it meaning daughter, all of a sudden now it means a bayis, a home. And we know in other places in Chazal where a wife is often referred to as a home. So taking her as a home means essentially that Mordechai married her. This is what we're learning here. Mordechai married his close relative Esther. He didn't just adopt her. Okay? Now, there's a passage from one of the most famous commentaries on the Megillah, is known as the commentary authored by Reb Shlomo Al-Kabetz in the 16th century, Manos Halevi. And in Manos Halevi, he addresses this teaching from Chazal. Let's look at the conflicting feelings that he expresses in this passage. He writes as follows, Hein emes, I'll tell you the truth. Yomim vishanim yoshafti, for days and years I've been sitting, mashmim umarid, bewildered. Alma dibru chachamim davar zar kazeh. Why did the chachamim teach us this odd teaching that he married her? Why is he saying it's odd? Well, on two levels. There's the pshat level and the ethics level. On the pshat level, remember the whole search of Achashverosh, what do the people say? You're looking for naros pesulos, unmarried women. That's what the whole story over there is about and stressed multiple times. So all of a sudden now, Esther, who's married to Achashverosh, is going. So that's a pshat. Esther, who's married to Mordechai, is going to Achashverosh. That's a pshat challenge. A ethics challenge is, it's an unmarried woman going to Achashverosh. No. But now it's Eshes Ish being given to Achashverosh. We don't protect our marriages. We don't protect Jewish marriages. We don't fight for our marriages. All of a sudden, the ethical stakes rise. And so the Manos Halevi is saying, what's going on? Why are the Chazal teaching us this? V'anashim ibnei Yisrael and other Jews, Rabbim v'nichbadim, many prominent ones, histiru panim mimenu. They have hit it. This is a pun, Esther. Histiru panim mimenu. They pretend this teaching doesn't exist. They ignore this teaching essentially. Umayhem chisku pneim lachishay. Some of them even go so far as to deny it. I don't know exactly what he means, but like say, nah, don't trust that Chazal. Go with Pshuto Shal Mikra. And indeed, many levas means levas, and end the story. V'amahadrin, mino mahadrin. In fact, some who are, I don't know exactly what he means over here, but a unique category within the deniers, Amru, they say, no, don't take it so literally. Shahoisa arusa l'Mordechai. You could just say they didn't have nisuin. It was just arusa. The first step of the Jewish marriage, there's two steps of Jewish marriage. One is nisuin, living together. The other is arusa, the putting on the ring on the finger, the giving the object of value in front of witnesses. They're not living yet together. And so then she's still a basula. And so maybe that's one way of dealing with this problem. And this is one way of explaining what Chazal meant. Who is the one who says this? So I found it in a commentary by Reb Meir Arama. Reb Meir Arama had a father who was named Akedas Yitzchak, Reb Yitzchak Arama. He lived in Spain in the 1400s, passed away in the late 1400s. His son, he wrote Akedas Yitzchak. His son, Reb Meir Arama, has a commentary on Megillah Esther, and he says, when Chazal say Labayis, they weren't living yet together, it was Erisin, and the Nisuin was going to happen later. There's also an Even Ezra here. The Even Ezra says they didn't literally get married, but Mordechai thought about it. Okay, so what that is, all of a sudden you reduce the problems here. The ethical problem is reduced because at least there wasn't a Nisuin yet. And according to the Even Ezra, there was nothing yet. It was just a machshava. And the pshat problem is solved here because she still remains, for all practical purposes, in a pshat, in a non-married state, suitable for Achashverosh. Says Reb Shlomo Al-Kabetz, not so fast. Vani ba'ani tamid achsek b'shuli me'ile rabbeinu hakadoshim. I'm not running away from Chazal. I'm holding on to their coattails. We're not going to abandon Chazal over here. And he proceeds very interestingly to say, I'm going to give you arguments of why Chazal said what they said and how it's actually somewhat indicated in the text. And he points out the following. He says, sometimes the Torah has a tendency when a woman is in an unmarried state, an absula state, to kind of stress that or say that. It does it with Rivka in Parshas Chayesara. It says, V'anara toivas mara ma'oid besula v'ish lo yada. It says that. Notice in Esther, it never mentions that. It never labels her status whatsoever. It says the king was interested in certain things, but it never labels Esther in the status of besula, number one. Number two, notice the words. It says in the pasuk, Likacha Mordechai lo levas. Likuchin. Likacha. That's the word Torah uses for Kedushin. In Parshas Kisei, Ki yikach ish isha, we're always using that language of taking. And I'm sure it could have said it here in many other ways. It didn't have to use the word that has the root kach. Kach so often is marriage, and that's his second argument. His third argument is Likacha Mordechai loy levas. Why do you have to have the word loy? Likacha Mordechai levas. Loy is like took it for himself. It looks like he's doing something for himself. That sounds like, when a man takes a wife for himself. And so therefore, for these 3 points, he says, look, when you read the text closely, you actually see an indication. There was a Rav, a businessman and a Rav, whose name is Rabbi Avron Danzig. He's famous for being the author of the Chayei Adam Sefer. He lived in the time of the Gra in Vilna. So a few years ago, they found that in his on one of the Svarim, that's a commentary on Megillah called Yosef Lekach, he wrote Ha'aretz on the side, and they were published a number of years ago. So he actually introduces a very interesting argument for why it was so important for Chazal to say this. When the pasuk introduces Esther, it says, and this is who she is. I don't remember the beginning of the pasuk right now. But then the conclusion of the pasuk says, what does it say right before that? Right before that it says, V'anara yefas toyar v'toivas mara. What's that got to do with anything? If you're here to set up a phrase that says Mordechai, the relative, took her in as someone who he adopted, how she looked is completely irrelevant. For the next pasuk, it's right. Okay, so tell me later when the king's guards came to take her, or servants came to take her, then say you can talk about her features. But why right before it says Lakacha Mordechai lo levas, it throws in V'anari yefas toyar v'toivas mara, which seems out of place. You don't use that in an adoption story, but you do use that in a marriage story, and so then it makes sense. Hanari yefas toyar v'toivas mara. And Lakacha Mordechai lo levas. That kind of makes more sense. So this is the argument that he says. I'll add another interesting point. We know that there's a Greek translation to the Torah. The Gemara in Maseches Megillah actually talks about the history of how the translation there, it's only talking about the Chamisha Chumshei Torah, how this translation came about. It happened during the time of Bayesheni, where Jews living in Egypt, or maybe they came from Eretz Yisrael, I don't want to go into the details right now, they created this translation. So the Gemara in Megillah only speaks about a translation to the 5 books. But Paul, the Septuagint, which is the name of this Greek translation, exists for all of Tanakh. What the story is behind the translation doesn't need to concern us. What we need to know right now is during Bayesheni, this translation exists. And remember, none of the midrashim were yet were written down as of then in Bayesheni, and definitely not in an official way. Anyway, so if you open up your Septuagint at home and you check these psukim, you'll see over there that it says Lakacha Mordechai lo levas. You'll see that the word it uses gyneka. He took her as a gyneka. Now, if that sounds similar to the word gynecologist, there's a reason for that, because gyneka in Greek means took her leisha. Now, if you say a man took a woman leisha, it only has one meaning. He took her in marriage. And indeed, gyneka can mean a wife, or it can mean a woman, depending on the context. But in this context, it could only mean took her as a wife. And so what you see over here is that this idea that Mordechai was married to Esther, during Bayesheni, the Jews living in Mitzrayim who commissioned and created this translation, they put that into the text. So this is a tradition that goes way, way back. Okay. That all is scene 1 to our story. Scene 1 to our story is Esther is an Eshes Ish, a married woman who ends up with Achashverosh. That's number 1. However, Chazal make this even more dramatic. In Meseches Megillah, Daf Yud Gimel Amid Beis, they stel on the pasuk Ves Mamar Mordechai Esther Oisa, that Esther is doing what Mordechai is teaching her and saying. Amar Rabba Bar Lema. What does this mean? Shahoisa Oimedes Mecheka Shal Achashverosh teaches here a very shocking statement. She would get up from being with Achashverosh, V'toiveles, she would immerse herself, Yosheves Becheka Shal Mordechai, and would continue her relationship with Mordechai. What we're learning over here is, don't think that Esther and Mordechai are married, and that happens, and then it's over when she moves over to Achashverosh. No, the relationship Chazal are teaching us continued in this very odd way. Now, this also was noted by the Farshim, who struggled with this a little. So the representative of that will be Reb Moshe Chaliv. Reb Moshe Chaliv wrote a commentary on Megillas Esther that was in manuscript till very, very recently. It was printed for the first time in Tafshin Samach Vav, very recently. He lived sometime in the 1200s. We know very little about him. But let's read this very interesting text. And the question you all have in your mind that you were just too afraid to ask, he asks it for you. It says as follows. V'zeh tema gadol. This is very, very shocking. How is it possible that Esther would continue a relationship with Mordechai? And there's no way he could have still connected with her. Because they would have the eunuchs. Every king had these men, eunuchs, who were in charge of guarding the women and making sure that no one touches them. And you'll see, when Haman's decree came out, they're not even talking face to face. It's going through Hasach, who's working in the harem, who's part of the king's palace. So, how is it possible that all of a sudden she's continuing to live with Mordechai? Reb Moshe Chaliv is a little bewildered by this. Then he asks another shaila. It's dangerous for Mordechai to do such a thing? To have a relationship with the queen? And so therefore, what does he want to do? As often happens in these situations, he says, let's understand this teaching of Chazal. It's an agadata, and so we have the license to understand it metaphorically. So what does it mean metaphorically? So he introduces the following metaphor. He says that Esther living in the palace, by definition, her abilities in Torah mitzvahs were very limited. And so she found herself at 4 o'clock in the day forced to do an Avera, whatever it may be, Shabbos, Kashrus, whatever it is. But then 5 o'clock would come. So what happens? So many people say, look, because I had to sin at 4 o'clock, so throw in the towel, it's all over. And 5 o'clock, let me continue sinning. No, but she was different. She said, 1 second, I was forced, but 4 to 5, I need to do it. Now 5 to 6 is a new hour. So now I'm going to do mitzvahs. And I'm not going to do Averis. So her whole life was a tug-of-war or bouncing back and forth between a Achashverosh lifestyle, which represents Averis, and a Mordechai lifestyle, which represents mitzvahs and avoidance of Averis. A beautiful pshat, and it obviously has a strong moral lesson in it. But at the end of the day, the question is, did Chazal originally intend that? And how many of the Rishonim would have agreed that that is the right interpretation to go with? So maybe some would have, but we know for sure many Rishonim said, no, we're going to take this literally. Okay, so point number 1 is Mordechai was originally married to Esther, and point number 2 in our narrative is, and they continued their relationship throughout. And that brings us now to point number 3 in the story, when the Gzeira with Haman occurs. And Mordechai tells Esther that she needs to go to the king, and after the long negotiation, the pasuk says that Esther says, I am going to show up at the king against the rules. Against which rules? Against the court rules, against the rules of how the palace operates. And then she says the words v'chasher avadati avadati. We all know that these are dramatic words, they're sad words. The Baal Koreh reads it in an Eicha tune, so we know it's sad. Harder to interpret. Look at every Meforish, you will see a different interpretation of what is this double link. Obviously she's saying, and if something terrible happens, then ... The question is what exactly she meant. Every Meforish gives you another particular meaning for that. That doesn't concern us. What does concern us is how Chazal understood these words in Gemara Megillah Daf Tezvav Amid Aleph. Amar Rab Abba, said Rab Abba, Shaloi Kedas, when Esther said that is Shaloi Kedas, what did she mean? She meant as follows. Shebechol yoim v'yoim ad achshav. Every day that I went to him till now, it's ba'oinus. I went by force. I didn't want to go to the palace. I was told, you need to come. And we all remember what happened to Vashti when Vashti didn't come, right? Although it's not clear in the pasuk what exactly happened, but Chazal tell us that she was executed. So when the king calls you, you need to come, otherwise you're executed. So that's oinus. So ad achshav was ba'oinus. Va'achshav, but now he didn't call me. Now I'm going beratzin. Now I'm going on my own. And Chazal are assuming that going on the own, going to Achashverosh was not going to be just a story of save the Jews. There was going to be events that occur beyond that, matters of tznius. And so therefore, I'm going, and now it's beratzin. And so this is why shaloi kadas, meaning it's not, the pshuto is shaloi kadas says it's against the palace rules. Now what she's essentially saying is, I'm going against Torah rules. Till now it was permitted for me, because it was ba'oinus. Now beratzin, so I'm going against Torah rules. And she continues, the Gemara says that she continues, the chasher avadati avadati. What does she mean with these difficult words? Kishem sha'avadati mi beis abba, just as I've been lost and forsaken from my family home, because my father and mother have both passed away. Kach oived mimcha, so too I'm going to lose you. Why am I going to lose you now? Zok Rashi, avadati mimcha, I'm going to lose you. Va'asura ani lach, I am going to be forbidden. Remember, we're husband and wife. But now I'm going to be forbidden to you. Why am I going to be forbidden to you? The Eish es Yisrael shenensa. When the wife of a Yisrael, Mordechai is not a kohen. When the wife of a Yisrael is raped, muteres labayla, she can continue living with her husband. And that was my reality since the day I got here till today, which is why I'm able to continue living with you. But uver ratzin, if, however, it's ratzin, if this is something that I'm doing, I'm initiating and I'm going on my own, so now asura labayla. So now I'm no longer going to be permitted to you. This is what Esther is telling to Mordechai. Okay? As you can probably tell, we're starting to inch a little toward the answer to our question, because at the beginning we spoke about a middle case, not an adultery, not a rape. I don't want to do this, but Papoil, I am initiating and doing it on my own, and we asked the question, what is this? So it seems like it's going in a certain direction. We'll see the maskanas as we go along. Before we get there, however, there's an important passage from the Rashba that we need to address over here. The Rashba notes that Tosfos asks a moedik shayla, a very important question on this passage. It says, hello, why didn't Mordechai just write her a get? Divorce her right there and then. And you're going to say, oh yeah, but then when she's together with Achashverosh, so then you can't go back to your original husband. So that is true. If a husband divorces his wife, and this wife goes and marries another man, she can no longer go back to her first husband. That's a clear passing of the Torah. But here it's Achashverosh, here it's Znus. So if it's Znus, so the din doesn't apply. So Mordechai could divorce her. She will go do what she needs to do with Achashverosh, and then it won't be an act of adultery. And so the whole shaila is even going to go off, and she won't lose her ability to continue being with Mordechai. This is the shaila that Tosfos asks. What do you see in the shaila from Tosfos? You see, Tosfos is looking at this whole story in a very, very literal way. All very literal. This all happened exactly the way Chazal tell us it happened, number one. And number two, there's no mystery here. It's all open. All the information is here. And therefore, we could interpret it halachically, we could analyze it halachically, we can ask questions, we could give answers, have all those normal conversations. So what is Tosfos' answer to the shaila? So Tosfos gives an answer, says, a get, you need Eidim. Eidim, people talk, the whole town's going to find out about it, we can't have anyone find out that there's this relationship, and so therefore, or that there even was a relationship, and so therefore get's not an option. The Rashba is very unconvinced by this. The Rashba says that the Eidim in a get is only midarabanan. Midaraisa, you just need the piece of paper. So he should have at least done the get midaraisa. So the Rashba says it's not such a convincing answer. You also have to wonder, really, you can't find two people who have a modicum of confidentiality to be able to keep a secret? It's a shver. Okay, many mefarshim deal with this. The Rashba says that he's very bothered by Tosfos' answer. And again, why is he bothered? Because you could just write a get midaraisa without Eidim. And he concludes his piece And he says, the last line, Ela shedivrei agadahen ve'ein meishivin aleihem. Let's remember, let's not lose track. We're dealing here with Agadata. And when we're dealing with Agadata, we don't need to have these types of conversations, questions and answers, and this type of analysis. Why? So the Rashba doesn't tell us here why, but the best bet is something similar that the Rambam writes in his letter on astrology, which we discussed once in this setting, where the Rambam said, you have to be very careful with this particular teaching. Why? Because first of all, it could be it's a das yachid. Maybe all the other chachamim disagree with it. So you could have the teaching of Reb Meir, al tikra lebas ela leboyis. What if you have a scenario where Reb Meir said that, but everyone else disagrees? That could be a possibility when it comes to Agadata, number one. Number two, maybe, as we already saw some of the Rishonim say, maybe it's a metaphor. Maybe it's a remez. Like we saw Even Ezra and Reb Meir Arama doing. Maybe, he says, there's more information that they didn't give us. More background information that you need to know for this story in order to actually effectively analyze it from a halachic perspective. And the reality is that we don't have that. So when it's a halachic discussion, you're able to tell in the Gemara, is this das yachid, is it das rabbim? You're able to tell usually. And there's no reason to suggest that a halachic discussion is a metaphor. And there's no reason to suggest that we're missing information if the Gemara exhausted a legal topic, so we have all the information. But with Agadata, you can't have these assumptions. And so therefore the Rambam says, don't run to paskin or to make conclusions based off those types of passages. And presumably that's what Rashba means over here when he says, Divrei Agadahen ve'ema shivan alein. In other words, I would have never asked the question Tosfos asked. I wouldn't have asked the question. Why didn't you do a get? Don't go there. This is what they said. Try to understand it as best as you could, but that level of analysis is taking it to a place where it doesn't really belong. Now, Tosfos clearly disagrees with this, and that's interesting. And that really leads you into another topic of how to look at Agada. Is there a difference between Ashkenaz, where Tosfos is, Sfard, where Rashba is? But we don't need to go there. We don't need to go there right now. What we could say is the following: it is highly likely that the Rashba would say, don't answer questions that arose in the 1600s or the 1700s. Don't answer them based on these Gemaras and based on the story of Esther. Because if Divrei Agada and Ve'ema Shivan Aleim, so if we can't ask questions and we can't get answers, so it means you can't do full analysis, then you can't apply it to other cases. Whereas Tosfos' model would lend itself to say, let's look at that. To the best of our understanding, we could use that to resolve cases that arose in the 17th or 18th century. And that's what's going to happen momentarily. Before we get back to the poskim that we saw, there's one point that we still need to establish. And that is, we know Esther was married, and we know now she's saying that marriage is going to fall apart because I am going baratzon ta Achashverosh. Question is though, is she doing the right thing by going? So you say, well, Mordechai is telling her to go, so by definition it's the right thing. Well, then let's broaden the question. Is Mordechai telling her the right thing? Is Mordechai and Esther right over here? Because at the end of the day, if you're doing an act that's going to make you asur labaila, that's going to make you forbidden to your husband, I don't think it's unreasonable to say, maybe that act is immoral, maybe that act is unethical, so maybe they shouldn't have been doing what they're doing. So the Maharik, Rabbi Yosef Kolon, addresses this in a tshuva in Kuf Samach Zayin. He also has a case over there. It's a real case, but due to time constraints, we're not going to look at the case, just at the main point. He says as follows: Davar Pashatu. It's obvious. Yoiser beasa bekuscha. More than, this is an expression of the Gemara, that it's so obvious that an egg and milk is kosher. So the Gemara uses this to say something obvious. So it's more obvious than this obvious din. Ki Esther loy asa shum iser. There was nothing forbidden. V'loy haya b'davar afilu nidnu daver. It wasn't even a little avera le. No. Ela mitzvah rabba asisa. Why is it a mitzvah? Shehitzila kol Yisrael. Because with this act, she's saving all the Jewish people. V'teida dechenu. What's my evidence? Sharei bevoya lifnei hamelech. When she came to the king, what happened? Sharsa aleh ruach hakodesh. Chazal tell us that she had a moment of divine connection. Ruach hakodesh. Kid the Darshin on Hasan, the Gemara says mivatil bash Esther malchus. The Gemara says that on the third day she wore malchus. It should have said vatil bash Esther big day malchus. What does it mean vatil bash Esther malchus? Oh, malchus refers to the Shechina, refers to the ruach hakodesh that she had. And the Gemara uses that. He continues and goes on to say that Esther counts as one of the Nevios. The Gemara lists Sheva Nevios, female Nevios, and it says Esther is one of them. How do we know Esther is one of them? Not because of what happened earlier in the story, not because of what happened later at the story, because of that moment. And so he says, does it make sense to say that when someone is about to do an Isser, they have the Ruach HaKodesh dwelling upon them, elevating them for all future generations to the status of a Neviah? That doesn't make sense. So obviously, she's doing the right thing. She's doing a mitzvah. And so what we have over here is that according to Marik, all of a sudden, we realize we have to create separation, which is maybe not so intuitive. We have to say, if you do this, you're asura labaila. You're not going to be able to live with your husband, number one. And then at the same time say, yes, go do it, it's the right thing. It's more intuitive to think it's like, because you did the wrong thing, therefore asura labaila. That's the more intuitive way of thinking about this din. Suddenly we realize there's actually daylight between these two things, and they aren't the same thing. They aren't two sides of the same coin. One is, you did a terrible thing. That's one thing. Another thing is, you're asura labaila. And it is possible to be asura labaila and you did a wonderful thing, a great thing. And that's how Marik is telling us we're supposed to understand this story. He has good evidence because of the Ruach HaKodesh situation. Also, it would be very odd to say that Esther and Mordechai, who are regarded in our tradition as the highest of the high, would have done and engaged something wrong without having any statement clearly in Chazal saying that. But he goes further than that and establishes the point through the concept of Ruach HaKodesh, and he concludes this passage by saying, Va'afilu hachi, nonetheless, Nesra Mordechai Baila, she's still Aser, Mishum Oisa Maisa Shahaya Beratzen, because this was done Beratzen. There's a passage from the Tzemach Tzedek in Maseches Ksuvos where he addresses this issue. He adopts the Marik's approach and he says this is correct. This is the right way of analyzing this issue. The Shvus Yaakov, the person who received this question about this woman, he follows the Marik, and based on the Marik now, in this story of Esther, he says the answer is obvious. Let's read what he says inside. Din zeh, our case, our tragic case, Pashut va'aruch lefanenu b'tshuvas Marik. It's clearly addressed in the tshuva of Rabbi Yosef Kolon. I don't know if I said before, the Marik is living in the 1400s in Italy. Okay. He goes on to say as follows. When Esther said ad hashta ba'oinis, what did Esther mean ad hashta ba'oinis? It means, till now, I only went when Achashverosh called me. He pressed the button on the intercom, he said, get over here, so I went. That's mipnei emas malchus. Mashen came now, b'she'ein ha'ema machmasa be'ila. I'm not being threatened that I need to do this. Rak zera acheres aleha. There's a different zera on Esther, va'al rabin. And v'hi misratzes, miritzoyna toiv le'be'ila mishum atzala. So there's something threatening. There's a knife hanging over our heads. She's using be'ila to get rid of that knife. So then we say, Af al gavdish shapir of dalat salas atzma v'arabin. It's good that she did it. It's good to save yourself and to save the rabbin. Umikre anusa, and in fact, this is called an anusa. It's forced. There's no oynish. She did the right thing, and I'll even use the word oynis. At the end of the day, because she initiated, she's going, she's choosing to do this, Nesra al-Baila, she still becomes Aser to her husband. Therefore, I think the Isha Zu, this woman, our hero from the beginning of the story, Asura al-Baila. Af, he says about this woman, she didn't do anything wrong. She's saving a rabbin. Now, it's not as many people as Esther is saving. Esther is saving all of the Jews. She's saving 10 people, 20 people, how many people? But the Shus Yaakov thinks that that's not a significant difference. It's the same thing, and it's going to be permitted. He then concludes, forbidden to her husband, even though it's a mitzvah what she did. He then concludes the tshuva and says, but if, however, we're dealing with a real case of rape, where she was being forced in the more literal sense, then this husband should act like Mordechai did. And how did Mordechai act? Mordechai continued living with her, even though Achashverosh was continuously raping her. Mordechai didn't say, okay, well, I'm done with you. Mordechai kept up the relationship, and that also is a lesson to learn from. So in other words, you need to learn from both. You need to learn from the first part of the story that if it's a real rape, continue keeping her as a wife. But now that she went Meritzaina, she did this on her own, so now the lesson to learn from the Purim story is that she becomes Asura L'Baila. All right. Well, now you already know that the Noda Yehuda doesn't like this. The Noda Yehuda said that he saw this tshuva and he doesn't remember where it is, and it enraged him. He felt that it's wrong. So what did he feel is wrong about this psak din of the Shvus Yaakov? So the Noda Yehuda quotes the following halacha from Hilchos Yisodei HaTorah. But the Rambam says in Perek Hey halacha vav, Mi shechalav anat alamus, if there's a person who falls ill and their life's endangered, v'amru aroifim, and the physicians say, sherifu aseh b'dvar ploini me'esurin shabbatayra, he needs to engage in an isser. Let's say he needs to eat chazer, he needs to eat chametz on Pesach. Oisin u'misrapim b'chol yisurin shabbatayra b'makam sakana. So we do these prohibitions. We engage. No problem. Eat the chazer. We need to save this person's life. However, there's three exceptions. Number one, avodas kachav. Number two, gila arayis. Number three, shvichas dam. Three things we're not allowed to do even to save a life. Shafilu b'makam sakana ein misrapim b'hen. Even when life is in danger, we're not allowed to use these three tools in order to save a life. Says in Noda Yehuda, did we forget about that halacha? I feel like, Noda Yehuda is saying, I feel like we got a little carried away with the Esther story. And we're putting all our eggs in the Esther story basket and deriving things from there. Hold on, let's go back to basics. No pun intended. Hilchos Yisodei HaTorah. And what does it say over there? It says there, you're not allowed to use a medicine that's avodah zarah gil or to save a life. So read what he says inside. Just as we're not allowed to use those three avedas, so you're not allowed to use it to save your own life, so you're not allowed to use it to save someone else's life. And you're not allowed to use someone else's life, you're not allowed to save 2 lives. And if you're not allowed to use it to save 2 lives, you're not allowed to use it to save 10 lives. How did we reach a place, he's asking, where we paskin and we ruled that it's okay for this woman to do what she did? Of course, you can't turn the clock back. History is history. The relevant shaila only now is whether it's mutter labaila or asur labaila. And the Shvus Yaakov paskined asur labaila. But in the language, Shvus Yaakov, Rabbi Yaakov Reisher said that it was mutter for her to do what she did. And the Noda Yehuda doesn't understand. How do you get there? Where do you get that from? The Esther story. The Esther Shani. You can't bring me a raya from the Esther story. Why? So he could have said it's Haggadah, we shouldn't learn anything from it. He could have said that. It's not what he says. At least that's not the words that he uses in this passage. What he says is as follows: because this was about saving every single Jew from one end of the world to the other end of the world. You cannot compare and derive saving all of world Jewry to saving 20 Jews. Number one. Number two, there was Mordechai and there was a Bezdin, which is interesting. But, a Navi is allowed to say, although the din is normally this, to change it. So there is that concept. So he falls back on the fact maybe then was different, and you had Mordechai and you had his Bezdin. So now, and number two, we have Kol Yisrael, we have all Jews. Now the truth is, if you want to push him, you say, and where's your makar that to save all Jews it's mutter? Where does it say that? Right? But I guess his answer would be in the Megillah. In the Megillah it says that. And limit it to that. And don't extend it past that, because you have no evidence to extend it past that. You know? And so what ends up happening? What ends up happening over here is both the Noda Yehuda and the Shvus Yaakov both agree the woman's Asura Labaila. What's the nafkamina between the two? The nafkamina between the two is whether the act that she did is a mitzvah or is an aveira. The act that she did, we celebrate it as courageous, Mesiras Nefesh, amazing, or is it something, well, we understand why it happened and we're not judging you, but at the end of the day, it's wrong. So that ends up being the difference between these two poskim on this question of the Esther story. Now as follows. The emes is that there's a very similar parallel discussion that happens in another Aveira, the Aveira of Shvichas Damim. And we know that in certain ways, Shvichas Damim and Gil Arayos are very similar. After all, they're bundled together in the big three, for which generally we say, Yehareg Val Yavar, that a person is not allowed to commit them. even if it means death. Fine. So in the sugya of shvichas damim, one of the details is that a person is not allowed to take their own life. Just like they're not allowed to take someone else's life, they're not allowed to take their own life. Then we come to the famous question, but what about Shaul HaMelech? Shaul HaMelech. We're going to read about Shaul HaMelech in the Haftorah this week. What about Shaul HaMelech? If we read in the Navi, he took his own life. So how is that permitted? So many poskim have addressed this issue. But there's an interesting explanation that's given from the Marshal, the Yamshol Shloimeh, Meseches Baba Kama. He says as follows. What's the context of when Shaul took his life? Shaul had heard the night before from the Navi that he's going to die that day in battle. So he knew he's going to die that day in battle. He also saw that the Plishtim were coming and they were about to capture him. So now in his mind, a nightmare scenario plays out in his mind. He's like, I'm going to get captured. I know that I'm never going to be able to be released from that because I know that I'm about to die because I heard the Navi say that. Now, what happens when Jewish soldiers see their kings captured? What are they going to do? They're going to try to get me back. But they're going to fail because I know I'm dying. So what's going to happen? Tens and hundreds and dozens, maybe thousands of Jewish soldiers are going to die trying to free me. So there's many Yidden. The lashon of the Marshal is V'yiplu kama revavos mi Yisrael. Kama revavos. A nice few thousand. Revava is 10,000. So kama revavos mi Yisrael are going to die. So because Shaul knew that was happening, so therefore normally shvichas damim. But that was suspended for hatzalas of revavos mi Yisrael. That's very similar to what the Noida Yehuda is saying allowed Esther to do an act that you're usually not allowed to do. Meratzin, you're not allowed to go. But what allowed it was hatzalas kol Yisrael. He doesn't cite the Marshal, but it's very similar, a similar argument. The difference is, the Noida Yehuda says it sounds like from him it has to be minar v'adzokim mahoidu v'adkush. The Marshal says revavos mi Yisrael. Okay, so you can get into that discussion of where exactly you draw the line. Okay, so this sums up the answers to these cases that we saw before. And now let's conclude with a vart from the Rebbe about the topic that we just learned. In the Sikha of Purim, Tav Shalom Beis, the Rebbe taught the following. Esther represents being in a diminished spiritual state. How so? Because Mordechai grew up in Eretz Yisrael. Mordechai is Rosh HaSanhedrin. That symbolizes being in an elevated Jewish state. Esther is symbolized being in a diminished spiritual state. Where does she live? In the house of Achashverosh. That's very much a negative environment. That's number one. Number two, what's her name? Her name is Esther. Esther means concealment. So that represents a status of concealment, where there isn't an open connection to Hashem. As the Gemara says, that Esther is linked with the pasuk, V'anoichi haster aster pana b'yom. God is saying, I am going to conceal my face in that day. So her name, it's not just an accident, you see it's intentional, because the Gemara links her name with that pasuk, telling us that she represents that status of Hester Panim. In fact, it's a double Hester Panim. What's a double Hester Panim? Double Hester Panim is that I don't even realize that Hashem is hiding. One Hester Panim is, I don't feel Hashem. I know you're there, I don't feel you. A double Hester Panim is, you're hiding so much so that I don't even realize you're hiding. That's a double Hester Panim. So Esther, we've established, represents a lowly spiritual state. So you would say, when you're in a low, Mela, Mordechai, you can have Mesiras Nefesh. We could find Mesiras Nefesh when a person's in an elevated spiritual state. When a person is in a somewhat of a compromised spiritual position, don't expect anything from them. Comes the Megillah and says that we see Esther said, "V'chasher avadati avadati." I'm giving up everything. And remember, l'kuli alma, everyone agrees that what Esther did was right. The Marik said beferish what Esther did was right. The Noda B'Yehuda limits that to only if it's Hatzalas Kol Yisrael. Fine. So everyone agrees that what she did was the right thing, but at the same time she lost her husband. She's giving up her husband. That's a level of Mesiras Nefesh, to give up your husband. Moreover, there are svarim achronim that say, use the lashon kasher avadati, I'm losing olam haba and I'm losing olam haza. In other words, I'm ready to even give up my olam haba. So what do we see? Esther, in her, so to speak, diminished state, is ready to go on full Mesiras Nefesh, is ready to give up on everything. The Rebbe linked this to the story of the Baal Shem Tov. It's a Maisa about the Baal Shem Tov that once he davened excessively that someone should have a child. And so to speak, he forced God's hand. So he heard, or it was made clear to him in one way or another, that now he lost his Olam Haba because of this. So right away, the story goes, he became very, very joyous. And he said, now I could serve Hashem with no ulterior motives whatsoever, and now I'm in it just for doing what he wants. That's what the Baal Shem Tov said. So the Rebbe referenced this story. It says, that's Esther. Because Esther is basically saying, I'm losing everything. I'm ready to lose my Olam Hazeh, my Olam Haba, my husband, everything. But I'm doing this for who? To save Am Yisrael. What do you see from here? That even in a diminished state, it is possible to rise to the highest level of Mesiras Nefesh. And so therefore, the Rebbe said, looking at our own lives, when we make a cheshbon, tzedek, a just, not a flawed cheshbon. Sometimes we make a cheshbon about our own lives and we say we're in a diminished state and really we're not. When a cheshbon tzedek leads you to say, I'm in a diminished state, and you say, I'm in a maimed matzav of Hester. In fact, I'm in a maimed matzav of double Hester, so there's no way you should expect anything productive or good from me in any sphere, whether it's ben adam lachaveiroi, ben adam lamakom, in davening or learning or whatever it is. You should know that that's not the case. The story of Esther teaches us that even in the palace, even in an environment of Achashverosh, even when you're surrounded by negativity, even when you don't have the spiritual backing and biography that Mordechai HaTzadik had, Mordechai Yehudi had, nonetheless, you too can rise to this level of Mesiras Nefesh, and you too can do the Mesiras Nefesh in this extreme way, where Esther was literally willing to give up on everything. And the dagesh in our class is that everything was her family life, which obviously is very, very meaningful to people, and we should assume was very meaningful for her, and yet she was willing to sacrifice that. And so the lesson for us is that no matter our status, we too have that power for self-sacrifice and for Mesiras Nefesh. And we finished before 9 o'clock.